So this video I'm going to use to introduce fluid, electrolytes, and acid-base balance for our upcoming lecture on next Wednesday. The first thing that we're going to talk about in this particular lecture is we're going to look at what we know about water. So water makes up a significant amount of your body mass, almost half of it to almost 3/4 of it. And when we talk about water, we have to be able to talk about it in two different body compartments. We talk about intracellular, what is inside of the cells, part of the cytoplasm, and we talk about the fluid that is not inside the cells, that is extracellular. The extracellular fluid is always divided into plasma, or the fluid, which is the fluid that is in blood, or interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that surrounds the cells. So inside the cell or outside the cells, and then the extracellular, sometimes we subdivide into these two components. What you'll see is that plasma and interstitial fluid are almost the same. Now, what kinds of things do we need to think about that are dissolved in water? So the one that we're going to pay the most attention to is actually ions. These are charged particles like sodium or potassium ions, chloride ions. Those are the biggies that we're going to talk about, maybe calcium ions. And then there's also electrolyte, non-electrolytes, glucose, lipids, phospholipids, urea, creatinine. All of these things are not electrolytes because they are not charged particles. So when we talk about electrolytes, we can talk about them as their concentration. This is the mass per volume. And so what this means is that a small electrolyte would have a lower concentration than a large electrolyte if you had the same number of them. So if you had 10 hydrogen ions, that would be a smaller concentration than 10 calcium ions would be because the calcium is bigger. However, we more commonly will use osmolality, and that is the number of particles per liter, and we typically talk about that as millimoles per liter. So 10 hydrogen ions would be the same osmolality as 10 sodium ions because it's the same number of them. In certain aspects of nursing and pharmacology, you'll need to think about milliequivalents. Milliequivalents takes into account charge. Now, this is not something we spend a lot of time about in anatomy and physiology, but I want you to understand that the milliequivalents of a calcium ion, which has a charge of +2, would be twice that of the milliequivalents of a hydrogen ion, which only has a charge of +1. So milliequivalence is something that takes into account the charge of an ion because this affects how the electrical activity associated with that ion. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this is a comparison of fluid compartments. Your extracellular fluid compartments pretty much is the opposite of the intracellular. Plasma and interstitial fluids are generally the same, except that plasma has a lot more large proteins, such as albumin, our favorite large protein that we've talked about this semester. Intracellular fluids, however, are almost the exact opposite of extracellular fluids. For example, in intracellular fluids, you'll find you have very little sodium, and it's almost all in the extracellular compartment. Potassium is the opposite, and you can follow this list, I'm not going to read it to you, to see what this might look like for bicarb and phosphate and that kind of thing. Okay, so this is the most important pieces for you to keep in mind about your different fluid compartments. That water is similar, how we look at the different kind of ways I've told you, how we count the different ions that we might find, and then here you can absolutely expect on a test to have to know the difference in sodium versus potassium versus calcium in the intracellular and extracellular compartments.